guys, this video is about status and role and goes through some of the definitions that you will need for your group assignment this week. All right, so let's talk about this. So this week is all about social interaction, and one of the ways that we make sense of our social interactions is through our identity, and some of the most important parts of that are your status and your role. When you think about your status and role, it's not just about understanding yourself, but it's also understanding who you are in relationship to other people. So let's start out talking about your status, and that is a social position that a person occupies. This could be within your family as, a husband or a mother or a daughter or a sibling. It could be a job that you have. It could be your race. It could be your religion. And everyone holds multiple of these, and that's called your status set, and that's all the statuses a person holds at a given time. So let's walk through an example of a status set. This is my own. First off, we have the family ones: wife, mother, daughter, and sister. We also have statuses like friend, job and church statuses like teacher, visiting teacher, Maya Main advisor, and then just also Latter-day Saint as a general status is part of it as well. And then we have the broader categories, things like being a woman, being Caucasian, and being middle class. So on one level, this is sort of a look at who I am personally, but on another level, it shows how I interact with the people around me. So those first four really influence the way I interact with people in my own family, that I'd behave differently with my sister, that we have a different set of understandings than I would behave with just some random person down the street. Being a teacher clearly influences the way that I interact with all of you. It's different than if, we were just members of the same ward and didn't have that same connection through BYU Idaho. Being a Latter-day Saint, of course, changes the way that I see the world around me entirely and interact with that. And then we may think things like, oh, being a woman or a Caucasian or middle class don't make much difference. But when we talk about that, we'll have weeks on all three of those: gender, race, and social class. You can really see how those things really do influence the way you see the world, the experiences you've had, and the way that you see others. So look forward to those weeks. They're coming up. So status has some other vocabulary words that go along with it. They're on your assignment, so let's cover them. The first is the difference between an ascribed status and an achieved status. So an ascribed status is something that you're born into. You've had no personal influence on it. So for me, that would be being female, being Caucasian, being a sister, being a daughter, things like that I've had no influence on at all. And then on the other end, you have an achieved status, and that's something that you've directly gotten through personal effort or taken on as a volunteer. So, my job is an achieved status, a church calling is an achieved status, being a parent is an achieved status, being a member of the church is an achieved status, but most are actually some mix of both. So a lot of things will seem achieved at first glance, but there's been some influence on them because of how you've been born. So for example, being middle class, that's something based on, financial and other decisions my husband and I have made now, but it's also the way both of us were raised and the privileges that we both had in terms of education and financial security at an early age. Being a church member, is based on my own personal testimony and my own decisions regarding church, but it's also the way I was raised and changed the way I saw the world from an early age. Now, so you also then have master status, and that's one status that determines your overall identity. Now, a master status is interesting because the way society sees you may not always be the way that you also see yourself. So for example, here's this woman, and she's on the phone with work, but she is looking at her baby, and maybe that's how she sees herself in all situations, is that her master status is mother. But that may not be the way that the person on the phone sees her. They may see her first off as white or first off as a woman. This is particularly common if you're part of a group that has some sort of stigma or negative conception in society, or if it's something that's maybe kind of uncommon about you in an area. So, if you are the only Chinese person in your neighborhood, maybe the people around you are more likely to see you as Chinese. Or say if you're in a wheelchair and everyone sees that about you first thing and maybe have some misunderstandings about it, that you'll be seen first as disabled regardless of what you think about yourself. And then the last one that shows up in terms of status on your assignment is called status inconsistency. And that's where you'd look at that long status set and you'd see maybe two statuses that don't seem to go together. Maybe they have a different prestige level, maybe they have different expectations and just don't seem to go together. So two examples of that. My husband is a mechanical engineer, but right after he graduated college, had a hard time finding a job and was temporarily a substitute teacher. He taught, among other things, kindergarten. And so he would have some interesting conversations with people at church where they'd be like, oh, well, did you just want to be a teacher? Or why did you go to school for engineering? And he'd be like, no, I do still want to be an engineer. And he then had to just sort of explain the job hunt and that subbing gave him a good kind of temporary job that was easy to change if he had interviews. And then the other end, you have my mother-in-law, who on the one hand has the status of college professor. She's a very educated lady. She has a master's in English. But on the other hand, she's a huge fan of a lot of kind of teenagery music. She'll run their fan websites sometimes. And especially she gets a lot of teasing about that at family reunions where people will be like, aren't you too smart for that? And what do you see in that anyway? So when there is a status inconsistency, the idea is that either it can make it hard for you as the person with the inconsistency to know like which portion of your experiences to use in a situation, or that other people will have a hard time then relating to you because they're not sure what to expect from you and how you'll interact in a situation. Now, when you talk about status, I think it's also really helpful to talk about a role. So a role is the behavior we expect from someone who holds a status. So you hold a status, you perform a role. So just think about the role we expect of someone who holds the status of a student. You expect them to be attending class, you expect them to be studying, you expect them to place a priority on their education. In some other senses, maybe socially, at least for all of America, that maybe you expect them to party, maybe you expect them to not be that responsible. There's a lot of roles that can be expected from just any one status. And like you have a status set, you also have a role set. And that's the roles attached to a single status. And when you also have a lot of statuses, that can be an awful lot of roles. So here's a very, very abridged illustration of that. So there I am in the middle. The rectangles are statuses. I just picked 4 from that list, so it's not too overwhelming, of teacher, mother, wife, and sister. And then role set, you can see there in the ovals. So as a teacher, I have some roles as an instructor where, I make sure I'm in communication with you guys and I grade papers and try to explain things. I'm also expected to have a colleague role. At BYU Idaho, they put a lot of emphasis on professional development. So I work with other instructors here. We have discussion boards and meetings. As a mother, there's maternal roles, taking care of my children, making sure all of their needs are met, and that, we play together, and I just sort of love them and love being with them. But there's also a civic role expected of mothers, that, I'll volunteer at my kids' schools, that I'll look out for other kids in the neighborhood, things like that. A wife has multiple roles. On the one hand, an emotional role to be my husband's best friend and help me. There's also domestic roles that I, take care of cleaning the house. I make sure that our bills go in on time, things like that. Sister also has multiple roles. On the one hand, my brother and sister and I are friends. We'll do things together, have outings, but because I'm the oldest, they'll also ask for advice sometimes on like, oh, well, what did you do when your kids were babies? Or, hey, what should I do? When should I register for this class? So you can see how all of a sudden you have a lot of different roles in your life. Some statuses even will have, 6 or 7 different roles that they expect you to go along with them. And that's where we run into this last one, and that's called role conflict and role strain. So role conflict, I think, is one that will resonate with a lot of you. Being a student makes you really busy, so it comes up a lot, and that is where you have a conflict between the roles corresponding to 2 or more statuses. So for example, maybe you can't spend as much time in your student role because of your employee role. Or maybe you can't spend as much time in a parent or sibling role because of a church calling role. Usually role conflict has to do with time problems, but it also could deal with just like having to switch gears a lot. So maybe you go from being a really high-powered professional in one situation to not being very respected in another, and that could be hard. And then role strain is when you would just look at one status you have, whether that's daughter or athlete or African American, something like that, and you'd look at the tension just on those roles. So my example for this is that when I was in college, I had a summer job most years at a department store near my home. And I really loved some parts of it. I worked in the office in the basement, and some of my job was awesome. Like I loved printing out the weekly schedule sheets, and I enjoyed doing the gift wrap. I enjoyed helping customers. Those were good roles, but some of the roles were awful. So I did not enjoy cleaning up the dressing rooms, but I really didn't enjoy peddling credit cards to people. And they used to make you hit kind of a quota of credit card applications, and there were some days I would just go into work feeling sick because I'd helped people make their credit card payments as part of my job, and I knew that a lot of them weren't in a financial position to actually have that card, and so I hated it, and that made it hard to enjoy the rest of my job. All right, well, good luck on the assignment, and I hope this helps explain some of those terms.